Welcome to Wayward Writers. I'm senior literary agent and author Heather Cashman.
I'm author and writing coach Stephanie Bearce.
And I'm author and writing coach Nicki Jacobsmeyer.
Our mission is to nurture and enrich established writers throughout their publishing journeys.
We welcome all genres, age groups, and publishing paths through video podcasts, online webinars, in-person retreats, and more.
We're here to help you conquer your path.
Thank you for joining us today for Plotting Pitfalls with author Meredith Tate. Nicki, can you tell us a bit more about Meredith?
Yes, I'd love to. So Meredith is an author, travel fanatic, social work alum, and a bookworm who lives in St. Louis with her husband, young son, and spoiled rescue pup. She's never met a dog she didn't want to pet. And when Meredith's not writing, she loves photography, playing the piano, trying new recipes, and chasing her goal of seeing every continent. 5 down, 2 to go. Meredith is the author of several published books and hopes to continue adding to the list. Welcome, Meredith.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So can you share your journey on how you became a writer?
Yeah, so I have been writing as long as I can remember. Ever since I was a kid, I was coming up with little short stories and little poems that in retrospect were probably awful, but something that I did all the time. I was constantly reading these little short stories to anyone who would listen. And then in college, I drafted my first full manuscript. It was a YA dystopian. It was around 130,000 words, but it was a hot mess. And it's in a drawer currently where it belongs. But that's what kind of got me into wanting to write full-length novel, do it on a more professional level. It's just something that I've always really enjoyed. I love telling stories. I love plotting. I just love all that kind of stuff.
That's awesome. And you write for both young adult and adult, correct?
Yeah, and children too. I have a children's picture book that came out last year.
Oh, great. Can you explain which format led to the other and how that all came to be?
Yeah. So when I started, as I said, I wrote a YA manuscript in college. I didn't know what YA was. I just was like, I want to write about a teenager because I was a teenager. I was 19. And that's just what I did. And then in my early 20s, I was like, oh, I'm going to write about 22-year-olds. I'm 22. And it wasn't really a conscious decision to write a certain age group. It was just what I felt like writing. And then as I got older, I learned more about the industry, more about different age groups, and I did more reading more widely. I used to just, and I still do, read whatever I feel like, but now I pay attention to what's the genre I'm reading, what's the age group I'm reading. Even now, I feel like I want to write so broadly that if I get an idea for a YA book or an adult book, I even have a couple middle grade ideas, and I'm sure my agent is somewhere pulling her hair out because doesn't know how to handle me. But I just write what I want to, and I have a lot of diverse interests. I like different genres, different age groups. I read adult books, I read YA books, I read middle grade books, I read picture books. Now with my baby, we're reading a lot of board books. So a lot of Sandra Boynton over here.
Oh, she's great.
I love her.
That's fantastic that you have such a breadth of writing ability. It doesn't sound like you find it a challenge. Are there certain challenges that you have with just going between genres and age groups?
For me, obviously, YA, I think, has more strict parameters, especially with regard to things like word count, content. So those kind of things are obviously just things to keep in mind as you're writing. I know for me, word count has always been an issue that I bounce between. Sometimes I'm like, why is my manuscript so short? And then other times I'm like, how did this thing get to be 110,000 words? So that's been a challenge for me too, is just finding that right balance of word count, making sure it fits within the genre. And I actually have a completed YA manuscript that I've been brainstorming about how to age up to adult. So that's been an interesting challenge for me personally, because I've never done that before, to figure out how I need to change it and revise it so that it works more for an adult or a crossover audience.
Yeah. So you were saying your agent is probably pulling her hair out.
I was just joking. She's great.
Is marketing a problem when you're all over the place, or an advantage to you when you want to write? And what advice would you give to people who want to write broadly like you do?
There are so many authors out there who do write broadly. Marie Lu, Paula Stokes. There's so many authors who write in all kinds of different genres. And I think if you're passionate about a story, it shouldn't matter like what genre it is. Your book's always going to be stronger if you're writing what is speaking to you at the moment rather than what the market is saying, in my opinion. I know that's not in the same way. Go out tomorrow and write a 150,000 word genre right now, probably not. But I always say to go with your passion.
Yeah.
With what you feel like.
So it's been working for you. And I just think it's amazing that it's to be able to have that breadth is a wonderful talent. Is there any advice you would give to other authors who want to write broadly?
I would say read broadly, read across genres, read across age groups. Even if you don't want to write broad genres, I would still say that if you're writing sci-fi and you want to know how to enhance your romance arc, read a romance novel. If you're writing contemporary and you want to learn about tight pacing, read a thriller. It's always good to read across genres, and that's just something I've always been doing. I've always just gravitated towards all kinds of different things. People are always like, oh, what's your favorite genre and your least favorite genre? I'm like, I don't know. I like them all. I don't really have an opinion on that.
That's
So
great advice.
Yeah, and that's fascinating you say that, because recently and in the past, there's certain genres that I don't generally read. Sci-fi and fantasy isn't my biggest thread. It's thrillers and romance. But then someone will be like, hey, you should read this book. And I know you don't usually read this, but what it comes down to, it's not the genre, right? It's the characters and the plot.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? Like if someone told me that I would have enjoyed like a zombie apocalypse whatnot, I would have been like, no. But when the characters and the plotting and the pacing, when that hooks you, that's what, and I guess that's the beauty, right, of story and of plotting, is that you forget what world or genre you're in. So
yeah, and that's a good example I use too, is I have so many friends who will tell everybody, like, I hate fantasy, I hate sci-fi, I don't want anything to do with it. But then they love like the Marvel universe and they loved like Game of Thrones and like this type of thing. Because I think any genre can be appealing if you connect to the characters, if you connect to what they're going through. And I think any genre can really do that. That's why I tell people to hesitate to say, if you say, oh, I'll never read this genre, I'll never read romance, never read fantasy. If there's a fantasy or a romance or whatever out there with your name on it, I just bet there is.
For sure.
So one thing that I think is interesting is you mentioned that A is harder because it has to be tighter into that word count that is suitable for a YA audience. So thinking about the YA audience, your plotting is going to be different, maybe a little bit, or maybe it's not. So what are the most common plotting pitfalls do you think that writers experience, and perhaps even over different age categories?
I think for me as a writer and as a reader, I feel like beginnings can end up being a pitfall that you can fall into very easily. It's so hard to get that beginning right because you're under so many of the responsibility to get the reader invested, the responsibility to introduce the character and the world. And it's a lot, but it has to do it in a way that's not info dumping and that's not dragging and that's not all these different things. So I think beginnings, no matter what genre you write, is just so hard to get that right. That's what I would say. Maybe beginnings, or also pacing, I feel, is really hard. I know for me, that's a really big one. I struggle with saggy middles where I'm always like, nothing is happening. Why is nothing happening? And then I have to go back and I have to revise it. So those are the ones that I would say I've noticed both as a writer and as a beta reader and as a reader that I think can be hard.
Yeah, I definitely think beginnings are probably the very hardest thing. I wish more people would just write their book and then go back and write the beginning. Just start wherever you want and then just go back, and once you're at the end, go back and look at the beginning.
That's actually something I've been trying to do with not even just with beginnings, but just try and get myself to not write so linearly, because I always wrote chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And I feel like now I'm trying to let myself do, this is the scene I feel like writing today, so this is what I'm going to write. And then I'm piecing them together later when I know what fills in the cracks, because I don't always. Sometimes for a while, I would just sit there at my keyboard, like staring at my screen felt like hours, because I don't know what happens next. I haven't thought that far ahead. So now I'm like, you know what? I give myself permission. I'm going to skip ahead to when I do know what happens and come back later.
That's really smart. I think that's wonderful advice. And I think we all need to give ourselves permission to do the things that we're thinking about or where our heart or mind is at the time, because I feel like our brain has this novel inside it, right? And sometimes it's the process of getting that onto the paper that is the struggle. But I think if we just trusted our brain more, we might be a lot more successful, or maybe at least get it done in less time.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you think it matters if you are a plotter, outliner type of person, or if you don't plot, if you're a pantser? I don't even know how to say that word, pantser.
Answer. So I'm a big plotter. I can't do anything unless I have a solid outline, full synopsis, a list of bullet points, something. Like that's just what works for me. I feel like I have friends who pants the whole thing and finish a whole novel in like a matter of weeks. And I wish I had that skill, to be honest. But I feel like different people have different skills with regards to plotting or pantsing. And I just say, like, do whatever works for you.
I think you're right about the brains. Again, all of our brains work so differently. You have to go with how your brain works. Yeah. And if your brain's if you're a discovery writer, or if you're someone who needs it plotted, you need to do what you need to do. So sounds like you are somebody who really needs to plot it out. Can you tell us a little bit about your procedure for doing that?
Yeah. So usually when I get a book idea, it's for honestly the twist and the ending. I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm weird.
That's great.
The first thing that pops into my head, that or the setting, weirdly. And so I start from there, and I usually just take a while to just stew on it. And before I write anything down, I just let it simmer, let it marinate. I'll think about it in the shower. I'll think about it when I'm exercising. I'll think about it when I'm going to bed, and I'll just keep thinking about this book idea. And then when I start to have a little bit of the characters, I feel like I know more of the story, more of the conflict, then I'll start by writing it down. And usually what I do, and I'm so thankful because my agent is wonderful and she tolerates me, but I'm so often being like, will you read this entire synopsis that I'm just sending into your inbox? And she's the best and she's so sweet. But I do, I write the entire synopsis before I really draft anything. That's why I've had friends who are querying, saying, oh, why do I have to write the synopsis? I'm like, bad news. It doesn't get better. You still are going to have to write synopses. But
it's kind of a good thing, though, right? I know
you already have yours.
Synopsis, right?
Like
and then I'm like, oh, wait, I have no idea what this book is about.
Yeah.
I clearly am not ready for XYZ steps. Sometimes it's a rude awakening, but you would rather that than an agent or editor saying that to you. At least I would.
Yeah, and I like fixing issues with the plot before I draft the whole thing. Once I see it all there on paper, usually I'll send my synopsis to a few beta readers or critique partners too. And they'll be like, oh, this doesn't make sense, or like this part seems a little weird or something. And I'd be like, I wonder why they said that. Let me go back through and look. And then I'll start drafting. And that's like the far end of my plotting. Some stuff I've done like a weaker end of plotting, which is just I'll make a bullet point list of things that I think need to happen in the book. And as I write them, I cross out the bullet points. That's what I did with Shipped, my 2021 book, which was a rom-com. And that was different for me because I'd never written a rom-com before. What I really wanted to focus on was the characters, and because they hate each other in the beginning of the book and they grow obviously to fall for each other. And I was mentally working through, do we get them from point A to point B? And obviously with romance, it was a matter of scenes and interactions that kind of get them there. So I was just writing down my list of different scenes and interactions that they were going to go through that would get them from point A to point B to falling for each other, rather than a strict like point by point outline.
Okay. So it sounds like it depends on the project that you're working on, just how your plotting goes.
Yeah. Too. The genre. I've noticed when I try and write suspense or thrillers, things with an answer and clues and stuff, I need to be more meticulous about mapping that out. Who finds something? When does this information get revealed? And just to make sure that happens in a set order. Whereas when I'm focusing more on character development, again, like for romance, for example, I might not do that in the same way.
Have you, and if you don't want to, that's fine. Because of your workshop, I don't want you to reveal too much, but do you want to preview common pitfalls if you all haven't done that? Or
we talked a little bit about it. Okay. One example that I love to use, and I did use it in the presentation, but I'm going to use it again because I like it, is with making the character have agency, making a strong opening, all of that, which I think are two big pitfalls I've seen, is the character not having motivation, can't pinpoint like why they're doing this. They're just doing things that we don't know why. One example I have is the Hunger Games. So I think that's such a strong opening. And what I always say is that the Hunger Games, if you haven't read it, it opens with Katniss's sister her name being drawn for the Hunger Games, and Katniss volunteering this tribute to take her place. Now, I always say, isn't that much more of an interesting opening than if Katniss's name had just been drawn in the first place and she had been picked as a tribute already? I feel like we learn so much more about her as a character. She is doing the plot rather than the plot happening to her. Even though she's still forced into this situation, she still has some sort of agency. And I just thought that was such a good kind of early twist in that book, is that we learn so much about the character and the world just from that one scene, so much more than we would have if her name had been drawn from the beginning.
And she does it again in Catching Fire. She changes, the rules change.
Yeah.
Right. Spoiler alert, people, if you haven't read Hunger Games, first of all, go buy your copy. Second of all, but she does it again, right? Once you do it once, you're never supposed to do it again. But then the rules change. And guess what? It's a quarter
I was so mad when I read that. I was in Barnes & Noble, the cafe. I threw my book across the room. Then I was like, no, I got to buy this right now because I just threw it.
I think Suzanne Collins, maybe she was hoping for that.
It works.
It does work.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about plot twists and surprises, and that you really start at that point. So you plan them in advance. Do they just come to you? I just find that so interesting, because that's what I always want, is to have this big plot twist. And so I have the story, and then it's, with a plot twist. So
no, that's just, I guess, how my mind works, is I'm just, oh, that would be cool. That would have happened. What if the killer was like this person? Or what if this happened? Because then it's almost harder, because then I'm like, I don't know anything else. I just know that this is
but you know where to write to. I love it.
Do you have a what if party? That kind of sounds fun.
That's what I do, honestly. Like Freedom Trials, my 2018 book, came from what if prisoners couldn't remember their crimes because they were erased from their memory. And that's where that book came from. And then like Shipped, I was, what if there was like a YA You've Got Mail, where these people hate each other in person but become friends online.
So fun.
Yeah, I like that. We need to have a what if party, all of us.
Yeah. I love what if.
Do it.
Those actually make really great commercial premises too, because if you're asking those what if questions, it's like bringing in possibilities that ignite curiosity. And that's why readers pick it up, is because, oh, what if that were true? And what's intriguing, and I think that you've caught on to a really good way of forming good premises for novels.
Fun plotting.
How do you handle feedback during the plotting process from critique groups or partners? If you're maybe pointing out maybe a weakness in a plot or something, like how do you tackle that?
So when I write a synopsis, I usually send it to my agent. I send it to a couple close critique partners, and they'll usually come back with feedback on it. And I've changed full aspects of the plot based on things that my agent or friends have said. And I actually prefer that, because I love getting feedback on my synopses, because I'm like, then I have a better direction for the book to go as I'm writing it. And I feel like I have this blueprint for the whole book, as opposed to just writing without getting any feedback first. That doesn't work for everyone. It's just something that I personally like, getting feedback before I start drafting. I've always said that, I guess I'm weird, because drafting is my least favorite part of the process. I hate drafting. I love plotting. I love revising. I do not like to draft.
So when you take your synopsis that's been, looked at and everything, have you ever then, when you draft, when there's a problem that didn't reveal itself during the synopsis, but now it feels glaring, what do you tackle that the same way? Or
I have taken like hard left turns in a synopsis and just gone in a completely different direction while I'm writing, but I usually kind of circle back to the synopsis, just because that's, I guess, the way my mind works. But yeah, I've definitely changed things as I was writing. I've gone against my outlines completely. And I've also sometimes like brainstormed with critique partners, my agent, like as I'm drafting, brainstorming through kind of issues I'm having, and then go from there, use that feedback to change the trajectory of the book, like actively implementing feedback as I'm writing as opposed to all of it at the end. I like that because then I usually like to have a couple beta readers who know nothing about the book read it, who have never seen like the early stages of it, so they can tell me like, does the finished product make sense? Does it flow? Are the previous issues still a problem, or are they gone? So I do like to get feedback and revise as I go.
That's
I love
interesting.
brainstorming. I love brainstorming with my clients because we come up with so many cool and fun ideas, like just going back and forth, and it's two minds are better than one. But I think also you just inspire one another with ideas and places that you never would have maybe gone by yourself.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, Heather, is so true. I think you almost become more bold and like less afraid of just throwing something that in your head seems super wild, but you're just like, what about? And so you can be more extreme, and usually extreme is much more interesting.
So we've been talking a lot about the plotting pitfalls and everything. How do you balance out, because plot is incredibly important, how do you balance out your character development with your plot development?
Ooh, that's hard. So I'm someone that comes up with the twist and the concept first. So I feel like I get to know my plot way before I know and understand my characters. And as I'm writing, I feel like I learn more about them. And then I might go back to the beginning and I'm like, oh, that character actually wouldn't do that or say that now that I know more about them than I did before. So I try and get the bare bones down first of the conflict, the overall plot, and then I go back and flesh out the characters as I'm going once I've learned more about them through the first draft. Basically, my first drafts are like bare bones. They're always super skinny and not nearly long enough to be a full book. And it's usually because there are aspects that need to be bulked up significantly. Usually character development's a big one.
And it's so interesting.
Since you plot, do you ever find yourself like backed into a corner where you don't know where to go? Or do you think that's a problem that mostly people who just write on the fly have? And how do you deal with that?
I definitely have. It's a synopsis, so I'm not really going into huge details. I'm just saying the big picture stuff. I'll get to a scene and I'm just like, what happens here is like right now, for example, I'm drafting an adult suspense, and all I wrote in the synopsis for this part is that she like bonds with this person, and I'm like, okay, thanks, Meredith. That was real helpful. Or what does that look like? How are they bonding? How are they getting to know each other? Where are they? Like, what is going on? So I always feel backed in a corner, and then unfortunately, that is something that turns into a big issue for me, because then I just procrastinate for days. I'm like, oh, I don't know how to get out of this. Might as well just do nothing. And that's obviously bad.
It'll fix itself, right?
Exactly.
Always.
So that's
that magic fairy will come. Yeah. And what do you want? I want that fairy too. So yeah.
So that's been an issue for me, is like just trying to get over those hurdles of where I don't know specifically what's going to happen and how getting from point A to point B, even if it's just in the span of a couple of scenes. I'm like, I'll still need to figure that out because I haven't thought that far ahead yet.
Maybe this is denial, but for me, but do you feel like sometimes walking away and letting the subconscious mind, like sometimes I just need to walk with my dog and be thinking about something else, and then it works itself out. Now you can only take so many walks and you can only let it marinate before it's, guess what, button chair, figure it out. But do you think there is something to letting things breathe and marinate for a bit?
Oh, absolutely. I've put drafts down for like months at a time and come back and be like, oh, this is so obvious. Why didn't I do this the first time? And I do think it helps if you're looking at something over and over again. It gets to a point where you almost don't see it straight anymore.
Sure.
Just starts to blur together. But then if you give yourself some time off from it, maybe do some reading, work on a different project, do some beta reading, then come back to it. Usually I find that I have a much clearer view of it once I've had some separation from it.
I have a random reading question for you. So you said that you like to read what you're writing, right, in the genre or format. Do you find that ever makes you nervous, or there's a trepidation that somehow like subconsciously you're going to use something? Because I've heard some people are like, when getting ready to write, say, a thriller, I will read thriller. Yeah. But when I'm writing a thriller, I have to read romance or sci-fi or nonfiction. I wanted to see what people thought you were.
So I'm the same way, actually. So I don't read the exact genre at the same time I'm drafting it. I will usually read like totally different age group or genre. I drive my critique partners nuts with this because I'm always paranoid. I'm like, do you think this is too close to this? Do you think this is too close to this? And it'll be like books that I never even read before or heard of. And then somebody will be like, oh, this reminds me of this. And I'm just like, what do you mean? What is that? Let me go investigate it and go down a spiral for the next week. But yeah, no, I am very conscious of that and do not want to get influenced.
So how do we ensure our plot does not become so predictable or formulaic, but at the same time making sure that it's still engaging?
In terms of following a set formula, I always think back to when I was in high school. We had a chemistry teacher and she put just a bunch of random objects on the table the first day we were in class. And she told all of us to sit down and write what we saw on the table. So everyone did. And then she had all of us go around and read aloud what we had written about what's on the table. And it was an anti-plagiarism thing, right? It was like, oh, if you copy someone's homework, I'll know it, because everybody, even with the same thing in front of them, everybody writes differently. But I took that as you can have 20 different people writing the same concept and it would be totally different. So even if you are sticking to genre tropes, sticking to like a wide, broad concept, for example, in my book, The Red Labyrinth, there's a big maze in it. I could probably come up with a dozen books just off the top of my head that have big mazes in them. But as long as you're sticking to your own concept, your own idea, there's nothing that's going to be 100% original, right? Every fantasy is going to have similar tropes with others. Every romance is going to have similar tropes with others. In a way, we like that, right? Like I don't pick up a romance looking for them to walk away hating each other at the end of the book. To some extent, I think formulaic can be good, while also always going to be different because you're putting your own twist on it as a writer.
And also another way, you were talking about beta readers, and beta readers that write are great, but beta readers that don't write and read, like that person that has read every romance novel, that, hey, can you read this for me? Or like my husband is not a big reader, but he can guess a plot twist in a heartbeat. And it is so obnoxious. I don't like watching movies with him because it just word vomits. And I look at him, I'm like, why'd you do this? But when the thriller's done, I want him to read, like, when did you figure it out? Yeah. So maybe those people in the certain genres that are just savvy about taking a lot too.
And I actually think when it comes to twists, and I'm a victim, I'm a culprit of this too, is that I feel like people spend a lot of time saying, how do I make my twist so virtually unguessable? How do I make it so that nobody guesses it? When in reality, if it's a twist that literally nobody can guess, it's probably coming out of left field, which means it's probably not a good twist, because you want a twist that like at least makes sense within the realm of possibility of what we know about the world and your story. And I feel like when a twist does come out of left field and I'm like, yeah, I didn't guess that, but also like, why? Like, why did this happen? It doesn't make any sense to me. I feel like a twist that makes sense is more important than having a twist that nobody can guess.
I agree. And I think that it's not so much that they don't guess the twist, but that they want to read to the end to see what the twist is going to be. So if you've got them engaged in that whole plot and the characters, they're going to keep reading.
Yeah, it needs to be satisfying, right? Like they don't have to be surprised. They just have to be satisfied.
Yeah, and again, going back to the Hunger Games as an example, like we know what the Hunger Games are from the first chapter of the book. We know that all these 24 kids going into the arena, only one, or in the case of book 1, 2 victors are going to come out. So we know that all the other characters are going to die, likely on the page, but it's still shocking for us as we're reading, and it's still who is going to be next, when are they going to be next. You can make it so that we know what's going to happen, but it's still surprising, and it still keeps us glued to the page. Another one, like a historical fiction, if you're writing about a major historical event, for example, like the Titanic sinking, everybody knows if they're reading a book about the Titanic, it's going to end, it's going to sink, because we all know that's what happened. But like the movie Titanic, for example, it's so captivating. It's one of my favorite movies. And even though you know basically how it's going to end, it's still engaging.
Meredith, what if it hadn't sunk? That's
a plot twist.
There's
an
a plot
alternative
twist.
mystery.
Guess what? You're not reading a historical novel.
Exactly.
That
was
would be
put on the
surprising.
wrong shelf. Okay.
When you start with the Titanic docking, then.
I just would like to note that one of the reasons that we find things engaging, even when we know what the outcome is because our attention is on a different plot line.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right? Our attention in that movie is not on the Titanic
No.
sinking. Our attention in that movie is on the romance
Right.
and the mystery and the necklace and where is it from and where did it end up? And so there's all of these other threads that keep us engaged, even though we know. And
Right.
honestly, our knowing that the Titanic is sinking actually brings this like sense of doom and dread and like, how is this going to work out? Because we know what's coming. And so it actually even makes it more engaging that we know. So I think that you can do a lot with plot, especially using the things that you know are coming to create even more suspense if you use your threads right.
Meredith, what advice would you give to writers about plotting just in general, or writing advice in general?
Plotting, I would honestly just say read wide. I know it's cliche advice, but I would just say if you're struggling with plotting, like read across genres, read across age groups, and you'll start to get better at it just by practice. Also, like my current manuscripts are so much better plotted than my previous manuscripts. And I had a friend once, actually recently, she read one of my manuscripts. She was like, she's like, no offense, but this is my favorite book you've written. And I was like, why would I be offended? Like, you're telling me that I've improved. I would hope so. If you said this is worse than your like last 3 books, I'd be like, oh, I'm getting worse. Like you will keep getting better with practice. And the more you do it, the more you write, the more you read, get in a good critique group, make friends who are writers, share your work. That's just what I would say, is just bounce ideas off people and practice, read, write. Sadly, there's no real like easy solution. It's the same thing.
That's all good, solid advice, though. And so where can we find your books? And for our listeners, where can they get a hold of a Meredith book?
Yeah, so you can buy my books basically through any bookstore. One of my favorites is Main Street Books in St. Charles, Missouri.
Yes.
And you can find all my books on their website. I have also a list on my website of places around the country that have, I don't know if still, but have had signed copies of my books on shelves, and they're available through all the online channels. And some of them have audiobooks, some of them have foreign language editions. So
and we could recommend, if we want to have good plotting, to take a look at some of Meredith's books.
Oh, I don't know about that. I wouldn't go that far.
I would.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Meredith, I have one last question for you. You spoke so highly of your agent. Would you like to give her or him a shout out?
Yeah, so it's Sarah Landis at Sterling Lord. She's fantastic. I'm so lucky to have her in my corner.
That's awesome.
You.
That's wonderful. We are excited for your next book whenever we are lucky enough to get to read it. And congratulations on your addition to your family.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks for being here. It was so much fun chatting with you.
Yeah, this was really fun.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Wayward Writers.
Let's connect. Find us at waywardwriters.com, X, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
See you next time. Conquer your path.